He stepped into the courtroom with one goal: to defend a young soldier who couldn't speak for himself. But before he could utter a word, the judge ordered him to remove his military medal, as if decades of sacrifice meant nothing. A decorated black veteran silenced by the very justice system he once served. Why would a judge humiliate a national hero in open court? And what happens when the Pentagon finds out? If that stopped you in your tracks, hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories that speak truth to power. Now let's return to that courtroom, where silence met arrogance and something greater began to stir. The courtroom had settled into the kind of uneasy stillness that comes when something important is about to happen, though no one quite knows what. Then the doors opened. Clifton Ward entered with a calm that didn't beg for attention, but commanded it all the same. 66 years old, tall and lean, dressed in a plain charcoal suit. There was no arrogance in his stride, no flash in his eyes, but on his left chest, pinned just above his heart, gleamed a small military medal, gold and blue against black fabric, one that had no business being forgotten. He walked to the front without looking left or right, each step measured, deliberate. Some in the gallery leaned forward. Others scoffed quietly, not because they knew who he was, but because they thought they didn't have to. Judge Franklin Bowers, a white man in his late 50s, watched from the bench with that cold detachment he'd perfected over the years. To most, he was a man of the law. To some, a man who saw the law as armor for his ego. His voice broke the silence with surgical sharpness. "Take that medal off." The clerk blinked, uncertain. "Excuse me, Your Honor." Judge Bowers didn't repeat himself. He leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on Clifton. "I said remove the medal. This is a courtroom, not a parade. Military honors have no place here." A few people in the room exchanged looks. The smirk of a young officer in the second row twitched at the corner of his mouth. From the back, a cough disguised as a laugh. Clifton didn't move at first. He stood straight, eyes steady. Then slowly, without a word, he reached for the clasp at his collarbone. His hand didn't shake much, just enough that anyone paying attention would notice it wasn't age, it was restraint. He unclipped the medal and slid it into his inner pocket. He adjusted his suit. His spine remained tall, not one word. Maya Ward, sitting 3 rows back, watched her father in silence. Her fingernails dug into her notebook. Her breath caught once, sharp and short, then disappeared into her throat. Her eyes never left the judge. Judge Bowers leaned back, satisfied. "You may proceed." Clifton looked toward the bench, his face unreadable. He nodded once, not as a gesture of deference, but as if to mark the moment. He wasn't agreeing. He was remembering. And then from the back of the courtroom, a child's voice, soft but clear. "Mama, why'd that man make him take it off?" No one answered. Not his mother, who stared forward, lips pressed into silence. Not the clerk. Not the gallery, who now sat with an odd discomfort, like they'd just watched something happen that couldn't be undone. Clifton remained still. He didn't react to the question. But for the first time since entering, he exhaled, not in defeat, but like someone preparing for something harder than he expected. He was there to testify on behalf of a soldier, a young man being chewed up by the same system that once claimed to protect him. Clifton hadn't come to talk about himself. He'd come to speak for someone who couldn't speak alone. But before he could say a word, before he'd even been sworn in, he'd already been told clearly and publicly that his service meant nothing here. That was Judge Bowers' courtroom. And in his courtroom, authority didn't bow to sacrifice. It dismissed it. But what Judge Bowers didn't know, what no one in that room could have known yet, was that Clifton Ward wasn't just another retired black veteran. And the quiet way he took off that medal wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Because sometimes the most powerful answer to disrespect is letting the world see who really lost control. The clerk called the witness to the stand, and Clifton Ward rose just as steady as before. The medal was no longer on his chest, but somehow the way he carried himself made it feel like it was still there. He walked up, took the oath without hesitation, and sat down. From his posture alone, you wouldn't have known he'd just been humiliated 10 minutes earlier. Across the room, Sergeant Isaac Moreno sat with both hands clasped tightly in his lap. He was young, mid-30s at most, with a quiet fire in his eyes that hadn't dimmed even after months of court dates and whispered accusations. He didn't nod, didn't speak, but when Clifton took the seat, there was something unspoken exchanged between them. A kind of anchor pulled tight in the silence. I first met Sergeant Moreno in March of 2013. Clifton began, voice low but clear, in southern Kandahar. There was a convoy ambush. His vehicle was hit by an IED. I remember it exactly, front left axle blown clean off. He got out of the wreckage with a broken knee and a deep puncture wound to the chest. He paused for just a breath. I pulled him out myself, applied a tourniquet, packed the wound. We waited 93 minutes for medevac. He was bleeding out by the end, barely conscious, but he made it. That's why I'm here. Judge Franklin Bowers shifted behind the bench, already looking unimpressed. His voice sliced through the stillness. Mr. Ward, were you serving as a licensed physician during that time? Clifton turned toward him. No, Your Honor. Were you a battlefield medic? Trained medical personnel. No, sir, I was commanding the unit. Judge Bowers let out a breath, not quite a sigh, but not far from it. Then your testimony regarding the nature of Sergeant Moreno's injuries is, by legal standards, unqualified. Your observations are anecdotal at best. You are not a doctor. There was a pause, not from Clifton, but from the room. That kind of pause that feels like a hand going slowly over a flame. With respect, Clifton said calmly, I didn't diagnose him. I stopped the bleeding. From the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney Rachel Kessler stood. She was sharp-featured, confident, and as deliberate as the judge himself. A white woman in her 40s with the kind of voice that filled rooms whether invited to or not. Let's be honest here, she said, walking toward the stand. You're not a doctor, not a medic, not here as a medical expert. You're here as a memory, a feeling. Clifton didn't blink. I'm here, he said evenly, as the man who held pressure on a hole the size of a baseball until the bleeding stopped. I'm here because I was there. Because I remember what the inside of that Humvee looked like when the smoke cleared. Kessler smirked, turned to face the judge. Sounds very noble, Your Honor. But this isn't a war memoir. It's a courtroom. There was a snicker, quick, careless, from somewhere near the jury box. Clifton didn't move. His hands remained folded on the stand, but something about the way his shoulders squared made the room draw quiet again. When he spoke, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I didn't save lives with certificates, he said. I used my hands. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They simply stayed there, hanging in the air with a weight no one could swat away. Maya closed her eyes for a moment. Her father had spoken in public before, but not like this. Not with that calm, that precision. It wasn't defiance. It was something older. She felt her throat tighten. It was like watching someone carry a flag through fire without ever looking back. Sergeant Moreno's jaw shifted. He pressed his thumbs together to keep from shaking. His lips stayed sealed, but his eyes told the story of a man who had carried shame for months, and in a single sentence had just been told he wasn't alone anymore. An older man seated along the far wall leaned forward slightly. His cane tapped once against the floor, quiet but steady. A bronze star pin clung to the lapel of his jacket. He didn't speak. He just gave a slow, deliberate nod once. And for some reason, it was that nod, not the judge's voice, that held the room still. Judge Bowers remained unmoved. He tapped his pen against the armrest, glanced at the clerk, then turned to Kessler. Continue, counselor. Rachel Kessler returned to her table with the air of someone who thought she'd won a small battle. But the words Clifton left behind were still moving quietly beyond her reach. One row behind Maya, a young reporter typed without pause. No commentary, no expression. Just a slow, steady line of words marching across the screen. And near the top of her document, highlighted in bold, I didn't save lives with certificates. I used my hands. The court moved on. But the room was no longer the same. Something had shifted. Something had been said that couldn't be taken back. Clifton Ward stood tall, his back straight, despite the invisible weight pressing down on him. In his hand, he held a color photograph, one he had printed himself that very morning. It was grainy, but clear enough to see the blood-soaked sand, the torn uniform, and a young soldier lying unconscious with his leg bent the wrong way. Next to him kneeling was a younger Clifton gripping a tourniquet with both hands, his face clenched in concentration. This was Sergeant Isaac Moreno, Kandahar Province. April 18th, 2009. Clifton said, his voice steady. I was the one who kept him alive until evac arrived. I don't need to diagnose him. I watched him bleed out. He took a breath, then walked slowly to the bench holding the photo out to Judge Bowers with both hands. The white judge barely glanced at it. He didn't even reach for it. Irrelevant, he said, his voice cold and clipped. Then, without a blink, he slapped the photo out of Clifton's hands. The thin sheet of paper fluttered in the air and landed face up on the marble floor. A brief silence gripped the room. Then footsteps, deliberate heavy, crossed the courtroom. Officer Stanton, a young white bailiff with a shaved head and chewing gum in his mouth, didn't slow as he walked past. His black boot landed squarely on the photograph, grinding it slightly as he turned a corner. He didn't look down. Didn't acknowledge it at all. There was a soft gasp from the back row. Maya's hand reached for her phone like it had a mind of its own. She took a photo. No filters, no edits. Just her father's fallen truth under the foot of the court. She typed quickly, her fingers trembling but focused. They said the photo didn't matter. Then they stepped on it. Attached the image, then added truth under their boots. She hit post. Clifton bent down slowly and retrieved the photo. He didn't dust it off, just looked at it for a long second before folding it carefully and slipping it back into his inner pocket. Sir, he said, turning to the judge, with respect, that photo wasn't for you. It was for the truth. And the truth doesn't care if you're tired of hearing it. Bowers leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed something anger, maybe even a flicker of embarrassment. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned to the prosecution. Move on, he said sharply. But the room hadn't moved on. Maya's post began to travel. A nurse in Delaware reposted it with the caption, "This man delivered my cousin from Afghanistan, and this is how they treat him." A retired sergeant from Texas commented, "That photo kept my nightmares company for years. Clifton Ward pulled me from a Humvee before it exploded. I won't stay silent." And then came the first news outlet. A local reporter named Rachel Corwin, seated quietly in the back of the courtroom that morning, had taken note of the photo, the comment, the boot. She tweeted, "Medal dismissed. Testimony mocked. Truth crushed, literally." Retired General Clifton Ward stood alone in court today, but the internet is watching. Back in the courtroom, Maya looked over at her father. He hadn't seen her post. He hadn't noticed the attention rippling out from that one frame. But she had. She looked across the aisle at the jurors, at the clerk, at the other veterans seated quietly behind Sergeant Moreno. And she could feel it shift just slightly. No one said anything, but a few eyes were softer now. One man, an older black vet with a cane beside his feet, gave her a slow nod. The judge called for recess. Everyone stood. Clifton hesitated, then turned to Maya. "You all right?" She nodded, but her voice trembled. "They stepped on your photo, Dad." He looked at her, tired but calm. "Then we step higher." They exited together, walking slowly down the hallway past a few lingering stairs. One young woman, maybe in her 20s, whispered as they passed, not to them, but to her friend. "I didn't know who he was before today, but I won't forget." Outside, Maya checked her phone. 57,000 shares. And counting. The courtroom hadn't truly settled since recess. There was something different in the air. Something thicker, charged, as if the quiet itself had weight. Clifton Ward sat silently beside his daughter, hands clasped together, eyes lowered. Across from him, Isaac Moreno, still only in his early 30s, looked like he was holding his breath. The courtroom was smaller than it looked from the outside, but today it felt enormous. And yet one whisper still found room to travel. "That's General Ward," came the low voice from 2 rows back. The man who said it didn't raise his head. He was a black veteran, maybe in his 70s, cane resting against his knee. His face was scarred, but it was his voice that carried something sharper than time. "He pulled me out in Fallujah," he added, this time more to himself. The younger man beside him blinked. "You sure?" He nodded, once solemn. "You don't forget the face of the man who dragged you through fire." Then without another word, he took out his phone, fingers moving slowly, deliberately, as if this post mattered more than most, and maybe it did. General Clifton Ward is being humiliated in a Birmingham courtroom. I watched him save lives. They're stepping on the truth. If you ever wore the uniform and remember who this man is, just show up. Don't shout, don't protest, just stand. He hit send. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the soft shuffle of feet returning from recess, a few murmurs of routine. But outside, far beyond the courthouse doors, something had begun to stir. It started with a single man. He wasn't in uniform, not technically. Just a gray jacket, loose-fitting jeans, and a bronze pin on his collar, the kind worn only by those who'd earned it. He stood on the far end of the courthouse lawn, looking up at the flags overhead. Then he stepped forward. A second man arrived 5 minutes later, older, with a limp. He joined the first, then another, and another. Within half an hour, they were a line. No signs, no chance. Just men. Black-white Latino standing side by side in silence. Some wore old military jackets, patches fading but still visible. Others held their hats in hand, heads lowered. One had a photo in his palm, Clifton, with a unit in the desert grinning and covered in dust. Inside, the judge was growing impatient. He shuffled his papers. "Let's proceed," he said sharply. But the murmurs had started again just under the surface. Maya's phone buzzed. She glanced down. "Dad," she whispered. Clifton didn't respond at first. "Dad, look!" She turned the screen toward him. The post from the vet in the courtroom had been picked up by several veteran forums. Hundreds of comments. Dozens of shares. Underneath a photo someone had just taken outside. Of the crowd forming. Of the quiet wall of respect taking shape, without a word spoken. Clifton's hand paused over his knee. He let out a slow breath. "They're coming," he said softly. Not a smile. Not surprise. Just the weight of it settling in his chest like a steady drumbeat. The bailiff moved toward the back of the courtroom, confused. He opened the double doors, peered outside. Then froze. He turned to the judge. Sir, there's a group forming on the steps." "How many?" Judge Bowers asked, irritated. The bailiff hesitated. "It's growing. And sir, they're military, or ex-military." The judge's brow furrowed. "Are they protesting?" "No, just standing." There was a silence then, but not the comfortable kind. This silence had shape, purpose. Back inside, the man who'd whispered earlier sat a little straighter in his seat. So did Isaac Moreno. Maya looked around and saw it too. Shoulders stiffening, eyes holding more than fear now. There was recognition blooming in that room, the kind that didn't need words to settle in. Even the jury seemed different, subtle, but the difference was there. No one dared speak it aloud, but you could feel it. Respect was entering the room, not through the front, through the people, through those standing outside, through memory. Clifton Ward didn't say anything. He didn't look at the judge. He simply placed both palms on the table in front of him and sat up just a little taller. And in that posture, silent, wounded, but unbroken, he said everything. Maya could no longer sit still. She looked at her father, still sitting upright at the witness stand, his posture unwavering, even as the air in the courtroom thickened with the quiet presence of men in worn military jackets. They had entered silently, one by one, taking every empty seat with quiet precision. No one spoke. No one needed to. She leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. "Dad, why are you letting them treat you like this? You could speak up. You have every right." Clifton didn't respond immediately. He took a breath, then turned slightly toward her. His voice was low, meant only for her. "Because I didn't come here to remind them who I am. I came to speak for Moreno." The words settled deep in her chest. It wasn't that she didn't understand. It was that it reminded her. Reminded her of the way he used to teach her how to walk through the world with dignity, to never raise your voice just to prove a point. And that real strength came from calm in the middle of chaos. But this didn't feel like an ordinary battle. Maya's eyes shifted to the prosecutor who was scribbling notes. His lips curled into a smirk. Judge Bowers remained expressionless, unmoved by the growing tension around him. She opened her phone. Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed a short message to a friend who now worked at the regional military command. Subject urgent. It's about my father. She didn't know if the email would be read in time or even if it could make a difference, but she knew she couldn't sit back. Not when her father was being dismantled piece by a system that once celebrated him and now saw him as an uncomfortable reminder of their own failures. Up front, Clifton was asked to continue. He nodded and stepped back to the stand. Still, he didn't speak of himself. No titles, no honors. He spoke of Isaac Moreno, about the battlefield, about a young man who kept fighting after losing nearly half his blood, about a soldier being punished not for what he did, but for who he was. When Clifton finished, the room paused, not because someone told them to, but because something had shifted. Then a silver-haired man in an old army jacket seated at the back gave a slow nod. Clifton didn't smile. He simply nodded back a quiet salute between warriors, then another and another. Within moments, the back rows were filled with veterans doing the same, silent acknowledgments. No slogans, no chants, just presence. Enough to make the air feel colder, heavier, as if something unseen had entered the room to restore the balance. Clifton returned to his seat. Maya looked at him, eyes misted not from sadness, but something harder to describe. "Dad?" she whispered. "Are they here for you?" Clifton paused, then replied softly. "They're here for what's right, not for me." Maya pressed her lips together. She knew he was being humble, as always. But she also knew he wasn't alone in this. Something was rising. Quiet. Steady. Not needing noise to be powerful. Just presence. Outside the courthouse, the midday sun cast long shadows over the steps. Another small group of veterans approached the building. They didn't hurry. They didn't need direction. They looked at each other, nodded once, and walked through the doors. The courtroom doors opened. And then they were inside. Part of the wave that had only just begun to rise. The courtroom had emptied for recess, but Judge Bowers didn't leave right away. He walked slowly toward his private chamber, shoulders, heavy jaw, clenched eyes darting toward the floor as if trying to shake off a thought that refused to go. Inside the chamber, he closed the door behind him. The quiet was thick and unmoving. He reached into the bottom drawer of a narrow cabinet near the wall and pulled out a small, worn envelope. From it, he unfolded a photograph, its edges yellowing. Two young men stood side by side in the picture, both in uniform. One of them was clearly Bowers, years younger, clean-shaven, proud. The other, smiling wider, wore his cap crooked and his medals fresh from the ceremony. He stared at the face beside his own, eyes locked on it like it still breathed. Then he whispered into the silence, almost as if he expected no one to hear. They gave him a folded flag. No speech, no standing ovation, just a knock at the door and a handshake. He dropped his head, pressing his thumb over his brother's face in the photo. For a moment, something broke through the armor. Not regret, not guilt, just the stillness of memory. A low buzz sounded through the intercom. The clerk announced that court was resuming. Judge Bowers placed the photo back in the envelope and returned it to the drawer. He straightened his tie and looked in the mirror near the door. For a second, he didn't look like the man who had silenced Clifton Ward. He looked older, exhausted. Then he blinked, and the coldness returned to his eyes. Back in the courtroom, the energy had shifted once more. The veterans remained unmoving, their presence, like a silent wall of defiance. Clifton sat with his hands still folded, eyes forward. Maya watched the judge re-enter, her face unreadable, but tight with suspicion. Bowers took his seat. His gavel tapped once on the wooden block. His voice was even, but his words came faster, harder. "This court is not a platform for personal valor," he said. "It is not a battlefield for nostalgia. We deal in facts, not uniforms, not medals, not sentiment, not—" Clifton didn't respond, but his jaw moved slightly like he was grinding back the urge to speak. The prosecutor stood up ready with the next line of questioning. But before she could begin, Judge Bowers spoke again, now louder. "And for the record," he said, "this court will no longer tolerate theatrics. Medals do not belong in a courtroom." The room didn't stir. Not a single veteran flinched. But the silence deepened. It wasn't fear. It was disbelief. The kind that sinks into the bones and makes people lean back in their chairs, wondering what kind of man needs to silence symbols to feel in control. Maya narrowed her eyes. It was a familiar tone, the way the judge snapped like a man trying to outshout something inside himself. Not the room, not the lawyers, not the witness, but himself. In the front row, one of the veterans, an older black man with a cane and a chest full of service ribbons, tilted his head slightly. He said nothing, but the way he looked at Bowers was piercing. Not angry, just knowing. Clifton looked back once more at the gallery, then back at the judge. and this time something clicked. Not pity, but clarity. He leaned slightly forward, not to provoke, not to fight, but as if he was seeing through the layers now. The prosecutor finally began again, her voice unsteady. The room stayed cold. But for the first time, the man who held the gavel didn't seem as certain as he had just hours before. And somewhere deep beneath his words, the courtroom began to hear the truth. Not the one written in legal arguments, but the one that walks with every soldier, every widow, every family that got a folded flag instead of a welcome home. And for Judge Bowers, that truth had never stopped knocking. The judge's voice was cold, mechanical, almost like it wasn't coming from a person anymore, but from something that had already made up its mind long before the trial began. This court finds the testimony of retired Lieutenant General Clifton Ward inadmissible. He lacks current professional certification to speak to the medical condition of Sergeant Isaac Moreno. Therefore, Sergeant Moreno is hereby ordered to return all benefits previously received under false pretense. For a moment, nothing moved, not even breath. The entire courtroom stood still, like someone had pulled the soul out of the room. Then came the sound of someone stifling a sob. It came from the back. A woman, her hands clutched tightly in her lap, bit her lip hard enough to draw blood. She didn't speak. She didn't dare. But her tears were loud enough. Sergeant Moreno sat frozen, staring at the table in front of him. His eyes didn't blink. His fingers trembled just slightly, betraying the effort it took to stay seated and not collapse. His lawyer didn't look at him, didn't even put a hand on his shoulder, just kept scribbling notes, pretending this wasn't happening. Clifton Ward slowly stood up. He didn't shout, he didn't point, he didn't plead. He simply stood and looked the judge in the eye. Today, he said, and the word hung in the air like smoke, you didn't just deny a soldier. You denied the soil he bled on. That broke something. A murmur rolled through the gallery like a storm forming in the distance. Clifton wasn't finished. You say I'm not qualified to testify, that my medals mean nothing here. Let me ask you something, Judge. Where were you when this young man was lying in a ditch in Kandahar screaming for his mother? Where were you when I tore open my uniform to patch his lung with my bare hands? His voice was steady, but underneath you could hear it cracking. You think justice is some box you check, a set of degrees and court procedures. But out there it was life or death. No credentials, no transcripts, just a choice. Either hold on or let go. Judge Bowers looked down at his desk, but it didn't stop Clifton. He turned toward the silent rows of veterans seated behind him. Row after row of men and women in worn jackets with pins that caught the courtroom light. They didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They just stared, and Clifton nodded at them. He is not a liar. He is a soldier who lived. And for that, you call him a thief. Maya was holding her breath. Her hands gripped the bench so hard her knuckles had gone white. Then the judge raised his voice, not loud but sharp. This court has made its ruling. This is not a rally. This is not a battlefield. Clifton took one step closer, just one, then said, "No, Your Honor. It's worse. Because at least on the battlefield you knew who your enemy was." Gasps, audible ones. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably. And still the judge didn't say a word. The verdict was on record. The damage was done. But it didn't feel over. It felt like something had just been lit on fire in the middle of that room. And it was going to burn for a long, long time. Clifton turned to walk away. Behind him someone stood. Then another. Then another. Veterans one by one rising from the gallery. No words, just rising and nodding. By the time Clifton reached the back of the courtroom, over 24 men and women were on their feet. Not protesting. Not clapping. Just standing. And in that silence, the judge looked around and saw exactly what he had done. Not just to one man, but to all of them. The courtroom had not recovered from what had just happened. People were still standing, not knowing whether to sit or leave. The veterans remained silent, forming an unspoken wall of quiet defiance. The judge, clearly rattled, motioned to the clerk. "Close the file," he said, his voice low but strained. "We're done here." But just as the clerk reached for the folder, a piercing sound cut through the thick air. A sharp, urgent ring. Not a cell phone, not a buzzer. The red phone on the side desk was ringing. Everyone froze. Even the veterans turned their heads. The judge didn't move. The clerk looked over at him, unsure. "It's the secure line," she said softly, then reached for it with a hand that visibly shook. She lifted the receiver, listened for a second, then looked up. Her face changed. "Sir," she said barely above a whisper. "It's General Cassandra Wells, from the Pentagon." The room gasped. A few people actually turned around as if expecting someone to walk in. Clifton didn't move. He just watched the judge. Bowers blinked once, then slowly nodded. "Put her on speaker." The clerk fumbled slightly as she tapped the button, and then the voice filled the room. It wasn't loud, but it didn't have to be. "This is General Wells. Am I speaking to Judge Robert Bowers of the 9th District Court?" The judge swallowed. "Yes, speaking. I was informed of your ruling regarding retired Lieutenant General Clifton Ward. As a matter of national record, I'd like to clarify something for your court. His testimony was not a favor. It was a duty, one recognized under our military cooperation with the Department of Justice." Bowers opened his mouth to reply, but the voice continued steady and sharp. "When the Pentagon refers a witness of Clifton Ward's stature, we do not expect that witness to be humiliated. We do not expect medals to be disrespected. And we most certainly do not expect any soldier's injury to be dismissed as irrelevant." Every word landed like a drumbeat. Judge Bowers seemed to sink into his chair. No one in the courtroom made a sound. Even the clerk had her eyes wide open now, unsure whether to take notes or just listen. The voice kept going. "I served with Clifton Ward. I saw him lead missions where other men would have fled. I saw him carry wounded men through gunfire, including, if your court would care to note, Sergeant Isaac Moreno." There was a pause. Then the voice dropped a register, not loud but heavy. "Let me be clear, Judge. You may not respect the man, but the uniform he wore outranks every desk in your courtroom, including yours." Judge Bowers leaned forward, his face pale. He reached toward the microphone, but General Wells beat him to it. "One more thing. This call is being logged, and your ruling is being reviewed. Immediately." Click. The line went dead. For a second, no one moved. Not even the judge. Clifton stood still, head bowed slightly. Maya looked toward him, eyes filled with something between pride and disbelief. In the back, someone exhaled sharply like they'd been holding their breath since the phone rang. Judge Bowers slowly turned to the clerk. He didn't say a word, but the gavel in his hand didn't strike. Because for the first time that day, the authority in that courtroom had shifted. Not because someone raised their voice, not because someone shouted, but because someone somewhere far above had finally decided it was time to speak. And now everyone was listening. The silence after the call lingered like a held breath. Not the kind that fills a room with tension, but the kind that feels sacred, like the moment before a flag is raised or a name is carved in stone. Judge Bowers still hadn't spoken. His hand hovered above the gavel, not with confidence, but with doubt, as if he no longer knew whether it belonged to him. The courtroom was no longer his, not after that voice, not after the weight of those words came pouring through the speaker like judgment itself. And then it came again. The clerk leaned forward as if she could not believe her ears, but the voice returned this time, firmer, slower, clearer than before. "This is General Cassandra Wells, and I am not finished." There was no protest, no interruption. General Ward is a Medal of Valor recipient. He was awarded for courage under fire when his entire unit was cut off behind enemy lines. He refused evacuation. He refused comfort. He pulled 2 wounded men out of an overturned vehicle while taking direct fire. And he went back in. Twice. He has been wounded in combat. Twice. He has served this nation with a level of dignity that does not require acknowledgement, but it damn well deserves it. You could hear it now, the burn behind her voice. Not just military authority, not just anger, something deeper. The sound of someone who had seen lives changed, lost, forgotten, and refused to let one more slip through the cracks. "You didn't just question a man's testimony," she said. "You disrespected a memory we cannot afford to lose. You made a mockery of sacrifice in a room meant to protect justice." A low gasp rippled through the gallery, but still no one spoke. Because in that moment it wasn't just about Clifton Ward anymore. It wasn't even just about Sergeant Moreno. It was about every name never called, every folded flag, every mother who stood by a casket with no cameras, no speeches, and no judge to validate her grief. "You may sit on the bench, Judge Bowers," the voice continued now, slower, almost quiet, but the seat you just vacated was honor. And then the call ended. No dramatic hang-up, no sharp click, just silence. But it wasn't empty. It was full. Full of breath being held, full of tears sitting behind tired eyes, full of something sacred that had finally been spoken aloud. And that was when it happened. One man stood up, not a word, no gesture. He simply rose. He was followed by another, then another. Veterans, uniforms, old boots and medals, still polished from a time when they meant everything. One by one they stood not as protest, but as presence. The room which had felt like a cage now felt like a memorial. Maya, seated at her father's side, reached for his hand, but it was already moving. Clifton stood slowly. He reached into his coat pocket, not with anger, not with pride, just with intention. He pulled out his badge, the same one Judge Bowers had once told him didn't belong in a courtroom. He pinned it back onto his chest. No words, no permission asked. And this time no one laughed. No one dared. Even the judge looked away. Because in that moment the courtroom no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the weight of silence. The kind that doesn't beg for applause but demands respect. The kind that doesn't argue its worth but stands still and waits for the world to realize what it nearly erased. Maya could no longer hold her tears. They fell not from sadness, but from something older. From generations of sacrifice misunderstood and undervalued now finally being seen for what it was. And Clifton, he stood straighter than he had all morning. Not because he had won, but because the truth had finally stood up beside him. And this time it didn't need to speak. The judge's voice barely held together when he said it. This court is now in recess. Indefinitely. He stood, his face pale as if the blood had drained from every word he had spoken. The gavel never fell. He didn't even reach for it. The courtroom remained frozen in its silence as though no one dared to break whatever had just shifted. Clifton Ward remained seated for another moment, not out of hesitation. It was deliberate, as though he was measuring the weight of the air before moving through it. His eyes scanned the room one last time. The walls that once echoed judgment now felt quieter, smaller. He rose slowly, pressing a hand briefly to the medal still pinned to his chest. The same medal that had sparked mockery only hours ago now gleamed under a different kind of light. One earned, one acknowledged. He didn't speak, he didn't wave, he simply walked. And yet every step sounded louder than the judge's voice had moments earlier. The wooden floor creaked under his boots that had crossed desert sands, mountain passes, and now this courtroom. Each step carried decades of weight, and yet his shoulders were straight, calm, certain. Outside the courthouse, the press had gathered in a swelling crowd, microphones craned toward the entrance like sunflowers seeking the sun. A reporter pushed forward, her voice uncertain but pressing. "Do you feel justice today, General?" He paused mid-step just long enough to let the moment hang. The cameras waited. The crowd leaned in. But Clifton didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. "I feel like the country took a breath," he said quietly. "That's a start." He kept walking. Behind him, Maya followed. Her eyes were glassy, but she held her chin high. She stayed close to her father's side, not because he needed it, but because she did. Every footstep with him felt like reclaiming something. Dignity, pride, history. Inside the courthouse, Judge Bowers sat motionless at the bench. The doors had barely closed when the court clerk approached him, placing a single white envelope on the table beside him without a word. The judge stared at it for several seconds. It was sealed. Official. From the Judicial Review Board. He reached for it with a hand that trembled slightly, ripped it open. Read. His eyes scanned the page once, then again. A line near the bottom caught him like a blow. "Inquiry into ethical conduct and judicial impartiality shall commence immediately." He didn't speak. But in his silence, the sound of finality filled the chamber. He folded the letter carefully and set it down with reverence, almost ritual. As if somewhere deep inside he knew this was a closing chapter. Not just of a case, but of a version of himself. His gaze lifted, searching for the clerk who had handed him the letter. But the man was already gone. And for the first time in decades, Judge Bowers found himself in a courtroom where he was not the one delivering judgment. Out on the steps, Clifton stopped. He looked out over the city. He didn't say anything, but Maya stepped beside him, eyes still red. "They didn't get away with it," she whispered. "Not this time." Her father turned to her. Just a faint nod. But behind that gesture was a history of battles fought not just on foreign soil, but here in places that pretended they were safe, just fair. He didn't need to say he was proud. She already knew. Inside the courthouse, the echoes were beginning to settle. But across the country, something had started to move. Not with shouting, not with rage, but with whispers passed hand to hand like folded flags, with silent rooms filled with standing men, with eyes opened just enough to see the truth that had always been there. The man who had entered the courtroom as a relic walked out of it as a mirror, and the system no longer blind had finally blinked. Some stories don't need to shout. They echo in silence, in honor, in quiet courage. Today's story reminds us that respect is not something given by titles or robes. It's earned through sacrifice and protected by those brave enough to speak when it matters most. If this story moved, you take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who still believes in quiet justice, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more powerful, true-to-life narratives that honor dignity, resilience, and truth. Your support helps our creative team keep bringing these voices to light because remembering isn't just about the past. It's about shaping the future. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for standing with us.